The floor was soaked in blood. Thick, dark pools had settled into the carpet beneath her body, forming irregular stains that had already begun to dry at the edges. Her arms were bent at unnatural angles, one twisted beneath her back, the other reaching outward, as if she had tried to crawl or shield herself. A deep laceration ran across her throat, wide, clean, and deliberate, cutting through muscle and exposing cartilage. Beneath her head, the blood had congealed into a matte black stain, a stark contrast against the pale skin of her face. First responders paused when they entered. The silence in the room was heavy, pierced only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the muffled voices of officers communicating from the hallway. One officer, reportedly a veteran of multiple homicide scenes, turned away. Another commented in a subdued tone that the victim's body was still warm. No weapons were visible in the immediate area, but the chaotic spatter pattern and defensive wounds along the forearms indicated a close-range struggle, brief but intense. This was not a controlled or clean execution. The spatial distribution of blood, combined with the overturned coffee table and displaced floor mat, suggested a rapid escalation of violence beginning near the entrance and ending at the center of the living room. The victim, later identified as 29-year-old Shannon Hyatt, had suffered over 30 stab wounds to the upper body. The fatal wound across the throat appeared to be the final act, possibly intended to accelerate death or prevent further vocalization. Such a wound is often symbolic. In behavioral profiling, a deep slash to the neck is not merely utilitarian. It represents silencing. It frequently appears in cases where the offender seeks not just to kill, but to erase, to end the other person's ability to speak, resist, or express agency. Given the nature of this scene and later confessions, that symbolism becomes crucial in understanding offender motivation. Outside the house, parked less than half a mile away, Chance Dano waited in the back of a patrol vehicle. His demeanor was described by officers as calm, compliant, even polite. He had surrendered without resistance at a nearby gas station after calling 911 himself. The weapon, a standard kitchen knife, had been left at his residence, placed intentionally out of reach of his younger sibling. He had stated to dispatch that he was mentally unstable and that he feared he might provoke police into using deadly force unless he turned himself in directly. This level of self-awareness, paired with the calculated nature of his surrender, reflects an individual who maintained significant cognitive control both before and after the homicide. The dissonance between the brutality of the act and the calm precision of the confession is central to the psychological analysis of this offender. In many cases of intimate partner homicide, emotional escalation plays a primary role: sudden rage, panic, or fear of abandonment. But Dano's behavior suggested something more complex. His actions following the murder, remaining in the house, moving the body, making calculated decisions about surrender, indicate a staged response, not an impulsive one. The selection of the weapon, the clothing change prior to the attack, and the time spent surveilling the home earlier that night support a premeditated pattern of behavior. Surveillance footage would later confirm that Dano had driven past the residence several times before reapproaching. This type of ritualized approach behavior is common in offenders who experience a buildup of psychological tension, where fantasy and obsession begin to merge with planning and action. What stood out most in the forensic context was not just the level of violence, but the offender's relationship to the crime scene. There were no signs of ransacking or theft. Electronics, jewelry, and other valuables remained untouched. The motive, then, was personal, not financial, not opportunistic. The violence was targeted, intimate, and overkill. In profiling terminology, the presence of overkill, especially in a domestic context, often reflects a personal grievance, an intent to destroy not just the physical body, but the personhood of the victim. Later disclosures would confirm that Dano and the victim had recently ended their relationship. She had publicly accused him of theft and manipulation, and she had begun dating someone new. These relational dynamics may have triggered feelings of humiliation, abandonment, or loss of control in the offender. Combined with emerging or untreated mental illness, such factors can accelerate a descent into violence, particularly when the offender exhibits traits of dependency, narcissism, or paranoia. But even in the absence of clinical diagnosis, the facts are clear. The act was personal. The violence was excessive. The choices made before, during, and after the murder were not chaotic. They were coherent, sequenced, and meaningful to the offender. The scene he left behind was not just a physical result of violence. It was a message to the victim, to himself, and perhaps to anyone else he believed had taken something from him. The question remains: how did the desire to possess and the need for control transform into a belief that murder was the only viable resolution? In the hours preceding the homicide, Chance Dano's behavior began to follow a pattern consistent with pre-assault rumination. This psychological phase, frequently observed in offenders who commit interpersonal violence, is marked by repetitive thought loops, fixation on perceived betrayals, and the rehearsal of confrontational scenarios. Dano spent the evening driving around familiar areas, repeatedly circling the vicinity of Shannon Hyatt's home. Surveillance footage confirmed these movements, capturing his vehicle passing by at intervals that suggested not spontaneity, but indecision rooted in internal conflict. At approximately 11:11 p.m., his vehicle passed her street for the first time. Within an hour, he returned on foot, wearing a t-shirt and visible facial covering. A neighbor's exterior camera captured his figure pacing near her driveway. These actions, approach, hesitation, retreat, are not random. They indicate cognitive dissonance between violent intent and residual inhibition, a psychological resistance still present at that stage. His behavior falls in line with what is termed the fantasy-to-action progression, in which imagined retribution gradually solidifies into planned behavior. By the time Dano reappeared at the residence dressed in dark clothing and carrying a knife, the inhibition had been overridden. He had transitioned from ruminative ideation into operational execution. Statements made during his later interrogation support this timeline. He referenced changing his clothes intentionally, selecting a large kitchen knife, and concealing his approach under cover of night. These choices suggest preparation rather than compulsion. Although he claimed he had no plan to kill when he first approached the house, subsequent actions contradict this assertion. Cognitively, this shift is marked by the suppression of empathy, an elevated sense of grievance, and growing cognitive distortion. Dano's language in interviews revealed a belief that he had been manipulated, used, and publicly humiliated by the victim. His perception of her social media posts, including references to his theft and emotional instability, appeared to amplify his sense of persecution. Offenders with underlying narcissistic or borderline traits often experience personal criticism as an existential threat. This may explain the degree of violence used, symbolic overkill as retaliation, not just for abandonment, but for perceived exposure. According to reports, Dano believed that Hyatt's decision to share private information online had destroyed his reputation and disrupted his control over shared social circles. These perceived social consequences are significant in his psychological profile. For individuals with unstable identity formation, public rejection can produce an overwhelming fear of irrelevance or invisibility. In such cases, violence can become an extreme mechanism for restoring perceived status and eliminating the source of humiliation. There is also evidence of displaced anger. Dano made multiple references to another man, a friend of the victim, who he suspected was now involved with her romantically. The existence of this third party, even if not definitively confirmed, appeared to serve as an emotional accelerant. Offenders with attachment instability often exhibit intense jealousy paired with a fear of being replaced. His preoccupation with this figure further supports the hypothesis that the attack was emotionally premeditated, even if its precise moment of execution was improvised. In terms of behavioral sequencing, Dano left his mother's home shortly before midnight, having already gathered the weapon and changed into his chosen clothing. He drove again to the victim's neighborhood and approached the residence directly. What followed was a short, high-intensity struggle, ending in lethal violence. The physical evidence, including forced entry through the front door, suggests that the victim attempted to resist but was overwhelmed quickly. Based on injury patterns, the attack was immediate upon entry. The absence of verbal warning or physical restraint attempts indicates a low threshold for violence and a high level of emotional agitation. In interviews, Dano described the moment of forced entry as instinctual. He stated that he had been filled with rage and acted without conscious control. However, his subsequent narrative included specific recollections of the victim's final words, the manner of each wound, and his own internal justifications. He claimed to feel as though something else had possessed him, and he referenced the act of absorbing her spirit. This form of metaphysical rationalization is not uncommon in offenders exhibiting dissociative symptoms or psychotic-like thinking. However, the presence of planning and tactical decision-making complicates the assessment of diminished capacity. His reference to spending time with her vessel post-mortem is especially relevant. This language dehumanizes the victim, reducing her to an object of fixation rather than a person. It also aligns with pathological grief responses, in which offenders seek to maintain a form of control or connection through physical proximity after death. While this could be interpreted as evidence of psychosis, the fact that he remained lucid, communicative, and coordinated in his post-offense behavior weakens the case for legal insanity. At this stage, the subject's psychological state had clearly deteriorated, but his actions remained internally coherent. He operated with a personalized logic, shaped by delusional beliefs, but executed with intentional structure. This contradiction between disordered thinking and functional behavior raises key questions for forensic evaluation. How does one reconcile calculated preparation with claims of mental collapse? And at what point does obsession become ideology, justifying, in the offender's mind, the total destruction of another human being? Following the act of homicide, Chance Dano remained at the crime scene for an extended period, approximately 3 hours, exhibiting behavior that diverges significantly from common post-offense patterns in domestic killings. Rather than fleeing or attempting concealment, he occupied the space with a degree of psychological comfort that suggests a deeper symbolic relationship with both the environment and the deceased. His interactions with the scene were deliberate, repetitive, and oriented toward what appeared to be ritualistic control. After the attack, Dano moved the victim's body, not to hide it, but to reposition it away from the damaged front door. This movement, while possibly practical in function, reflects a desire to maintain spatial order and preserve the integrity of his environment. He later affixed a wooden board to the interior side of the front door, reportedly to prevent the household cats from escaping. When taken in context, this act cannot be interpreted purely as caretaking. Instead, it reinforces an underlying compulsion to assert control over the physical space, even in the presence of chaos and death. Offenders who exhibit this type of behavior often view the crime scene as an extension of the self, a place not just where the act occurred, but where meaning is stabilized and sustained. In subsequent interviews, Dano described a sensation of having absorbed the victim's spirit. He referenced cultural motifs involving soul transference, likening the act of killing to a spiritual ritual where the energy or essence of the deceased is inherited by the killer. This belief system, while ungrounded in coherent religious doctrine, reflects a self-constructed ideology common in offenders experiencing delusional thought patterns. Importantly, these statements were not accompanied by disorganized speech or incoherent logic. His communication remained structured, indicating that the delusional framework was internalized, but did not impair cognitive processing. Dano admitted to engaging in postmortem sexual activity with the victim. He stated that the attraction was not to the state of death itself, but to the victim as he remembered her. He emphasized the desire to feel close to her one last time. This form of necrophilic behavior, though rare, is consistent with possession-based violence, in which the offender views the victim as a permanent extension of his own identity. Such actions are not necessarily rooted in sexual deviance, but in pathological attachment and the need to exert complete, unchallengeable dominance. The act serves both as a symbolic reunion and as the final assertion of control, eliminating the victim's autonomy while preserving her as an object. Psychologically, this behavior aligns with complex grief pathology and distorted object relations. Offenders operating under this paradigm often display impaired boundaries between self and others, leading to behaviors that reflect enmeshment, entitlement, and obsession. The victim is not seen as a separate individual, but as a possession that, once lost, must be reclaimed, by force if necessary. The desire to keep the victim, even after death, fulfills a psychological need to undo abandonment and restore a perceived relational bond. Statements made by Dano during interrogation further support this framework. He described Shannon Hyatt as having belonged to him in an emotional and spiritual sense. He expressed resentment over her independence, her decision to move on, and her public criticisms of him. His language repeatedly shifted from emotional hurt to metaphysical justification, at times referring to himself as a god or higher being. He stated that people around him were not always real, but instead acted as vessels or symbols in a larger system of meaning, known only to him. This type of grandiose delusion, often observed in offenders with emerging psychotic disorders or narcissistic decompensation, allows the subject to reinterpret their reality in a way that minimizes responsibility and elevates self-perception. When coupled with interpersonal rejection, such beliefs can rapidly become violent, particularly when the offender concludes that eliminating the other person is the only way to restore equilibrium. In this model, the murder is not a crime, it is a transformation. The act of killing becomes necessary to complete an internal narrative in which the offender reclaims what they believe has been taken or corrupted. Throughout his confession, Dano displayed no genuine emotional distress regarding the death itself. He did, however, express concern over the consequences, legal, social, and familial. He discussed the loss of respect from those around him, the disappointment he had caused, and his belief that this event marked the end of his life in any meaningful sense. These reflections do not indicate remorse in the conventional sense, but rather a recognition that his constructed identity had collapsed. Without the relationship, without the illusion of control, and without the social image he had maintained, the only path left to reclaim agency was to eliminate the source of perceived disorder. The intersection of spiritual delusion, romantic obsession, and pathological control creates a framework in which homicide becomes justified, even necessary, within the offender's distorted value system. Dano's narrative reveals not just a breakdown of reality, but a restructuring of it. One where he is both the agent of judgment and the receiver of its consequences. The remaining question is how this internal ideology, shaped by fantasy, reinforced by grievance, led to a crime so calculated in execution, yet so disconnected from human empathy. After the homicide, Chance Dano remained inside the victim's residence for an extended duration, engaging in a sequence of behaviors that indicate both cognitive organization and symbolic intent. These actions went beyond concealment or avoidance. They functioned as part of a personal ritual, an effort to exert control not only over the physical environment, but over the meaning of what had occurred. He secured the front door by screwing a piece of plywood into place from the inside. He stated later that this was to prevent the household cats from escaping. In forensic analysis, this type of post-offense modification is rarely about practical concerns alone. The act of sealing the crime scene may represent a psychological need to maintain containment, both literal and symbolic. In many cases involving obsessive relational violence, the offender treats the scene as an extension of the emotional bond, attempting to preserve a final state of connection unspoiled by outside interference. Dano then took the victim's phone and keys. He did not attempt to unlock or use the device, and he made no effort to flee the area using the stolen items. His later explanation, that he took them without understanding why, suggests compulsion rather than utility. In cases involving possession-based offenders, the retention of personal items frequently serves as a method of prolonging psychological attachment. These objects become transitional, holding perceived fragments of the victim's identity, which the offender believes can be accessed, preserved, or controlled. He changed clothing after the murder, leaving the original outfit near the washing machine in his residence. This change, while seemingly procedural, fits within a broader behavioral pattern. Offenders who engage in personalized violence often undergo a symbolic reset after the act, shedding what is associated with the moment of transformation. In some cases, this is interpreted as an effort to cleanse oneself, not only of evidence, but of the psychological burden of the crime, though the desire for cleansing rarely corresponds with actual remorse. One of the most notable post-crime behaviors occurred after the murder, but before the 911 call. Dano returned to the scene multiple times during the night. Surveillance footage captured his shadow moving behind the back window, pacing through the house, and appearing in various rooms. These repeated entries suggest not hesitation, but maintenance. Offenders who re-engage with a crime scene often do so not to reevaluate, but to re-experience. In forensic psychology, this is sometimes referred to as scene imprinting, a compulsion to remain physically close to the moment of perceived psychological resolution. When questioned about his decision to remain with the body, Dano did not express regret. He described a sense of presence, of wanting to spend time with what he called the vessel. His use of depersonalized language reinforces the earlier assessment that he had cognitively distanced himself from the humanity of the victim. He viewed her less as a person, and more as an object through which he could reassert power and significance. The forensic timeline indicates that he spent several hours near the body, making minor adjustments to the scene and engaging in intermittent, solitary activity. He smoked cigarettes outside the home, checked his phone, and paced between rooms. This behavior lacks the erratic features of post-incident panic. Instead, it reflects stabilization. For an individual whose sense of self had been deteriorating, the crime appears to have served as a psychological anchor, a moment in which confusion gave way to perceived clarity, no matter how distorted that clarity may have been. Dano later made statements consistent with disorganized grief and grandiose belief structures. He claimed that Shannon had begun appearing to him before the homicide, that he had seen versions of her in crowds, and that he believed she was spiritually tracking his movements. These experiences, while hallucinatory in nature, were not accompanied by acute distress. He interpreted them as confirmation that a metaphysical connection still existed, one that needed to be resolved physically. When viewed within this framework, the murder becomes the conclusion of an internal narrative, a story where the offender believes that only through killing can he reclaim what was lost. His lack of urgency following the act, combined with the meticulous handling of the space, suggests that the murder itself was not experienced as chaotic. On the contrary, it appears to have brought a temporary psychological order to a mind otherwise fragmented by delusion, dependency, and interpersonal dysfunction. He described feeling less alone afterward, believing that something had been transferred to him. This perception mirrors patterns found in cases involving magical thinking or fusion-based pathology, where offenders seek to absorb traits, energy, or symbolic identity through physical domination or violence. At no point did Dano attempt to frame the event as an accident. His admissions were direct. He did not minimize the brutality. Instead, he contextualized it through a personal belief system that prioritized emotional need over moral boundary. In such offenders, guilt does not operate on conventional terms. It is not based on the suffering of others, but on the disruption of internal order. When that order is momentarily restored through violence, remorse becomes secondary to relief. The crime scene, therefore, was not abandoned, it was completed. Dano exited only when his mental narrative had concluded. He did not destroy evidence. He did not attempt evasion. The outcome had been achieved. The emotional arc, rejection, fixation, possession, and closure, had reached its endpoint. What remains is the question of whether such internal logic, once formed and acted upon, can be dismantled, or whether the identity that committed the act now fully defines the one who remains. Bana. Following his arrest, Chance Dano was transferred to the custody of the Franklin County authorities, where he underwent further interviews and psychiatric screening. Throughout the initial processing, his demeanor remained cooperative. He answered questions with clarity and retained awareness of his legal situation. He did not request an attorney during the early stages of interrogation, nor did he attempt to recant or alter the nature of his confession. His cognitive functioning appeared intact, and his grasp of temporal, spatial, and personal orientation was preserved. During formal interrogation, Dano provided a detailed account of the events leading up to and following the homicide. His statements were internally consistent and aligned with physical evidence collected from the scene. When asked about motive, he oscillated between personal grievance, emotional desperation, and metaphysical belief. He described feelings of betrayal, humiliation, and fear of abandonment, but consistently framed these emotions through a distorted sense of entitlement and loss of control. He did not express traditional remorse for the victim's suffering, but acknowledged that his actions had caused irreversible harm. The language he used emphasized consequences rather than empathy, focused more on the impact to his family and his future than the life he had taken. From a legal standpoint, the confession eliminated the need for a prolonged trial. On August 8, 2024, Dano accepted a plea agreement, admitting guilt to charges of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 31 years. This outcome reflects a clear recognition by the court that, despite claims of mental illness, the defendant maintained sufficient capacity to understand the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. The plea also spared the victim's family from reliving the details in a public courtroom, though the psychological impact of the crime remains enduring. Psychological assessment of Dano reveals a subject with long-standing emotional instability, impaired relational functioning, and elements of grandiose and magical thinking. He disclosed a history of mental health issues, including bipolar disorder and suspected psychosis, though consistent treatment had not been maintained. His belief system at the time of the offense included delusions of spiritual absorption and self-ascribed divinity. Yet these beliefs were not accompanied by behavioral disorganization or impaired communication. He maintained the ability to plan, execute, and reflect on his behavior. These characteristics align more closely with a personality structure exhibiting narcissistic features and intermittent psychotic ideation, rather than a primary psychotic disorder. The ritualistic nature of the homicide, combined with the lack of escape attempt, indicates that the act fulfilled a psychological function for the offender. He did not kill in a state of panic or cognitive blackout. He followed a progression from fixation to planning to action to post-event stabilization. In this progression, the murder became the means through which his internal narrative was resolved. He reclaimed power, eliminated perceived betrayal, and re-established control over a collapsing identity. For offenders with this type of profile, violence is not accidental or reactive. It is interpretive. The act is justified internally, even when condemned externally. It is important to note that not all offenders who express delusional content meet the legal threshold for insanity. The presence of structured beliefs, even if irrational, does not negate accountability unless those beliefs prevent the individual from understanding the legal or moral dimensions of their actions. In this case, Dano consistently acknowledged that what he did was illegal and would result in severe punishment. He surrendered on his own terms, expressed anticipation of incarceration, and demonstrated an organized effort to communicate his version of events. These behaviors confirm criminal responsibility within a forensic context. The impact of this case extends beyond the individual offender. It highlights the complexity of assessing threat in interpersonal relationships, where emotional manipulation, dependency, and psychological instability coexist. Dano exhibited multiple warning signs: possessiveness, control, public humiliation, and escalating paranoia. Yet none resulted in formal intervention prior to the offense. The victim had voiced concerns and shared information online, but no protective actions were initiated. This gap between behavioral red flags and institutional response is a common feature in cases of intimate partner homicide, particularly when mental illness is present but untreated. From a criminological perspective, the case reflects the dangerous intersection between untreated psychological deterioration and unmet relational expectations. It demonstrates how personal grievance can become the foundation for ideological violence, and how offenders can develop internal belief systems that support, justify, and ritualize acts of extreme brutality. These systems are often invisible to those around them until the violence occurs. Recognizing them requires a multidisciplinary approach, involving mental health professionals, law enforcement, and informed community response. Chance Dano now resides in a correctional facility under a sentence that reflects both the gravity of his crime and the partial mitigation offered by his mental health history. He is not considered legally insane, but he is recognized as a psychologically complex individual whose crime cannot be reduced to a singular cause. It is the product of cumulative failures, personal, relational, and systemic. This case serves as a reminder that the line between obsession and violence can be crossed not in moments of rage, but through prolonged emotional collapse masked by outward functionality. In such cases, justice offers resolution, but not restoration. The victim is lost, the damage is permanent, and the true abyss lies not in the act itself, but in the silence and inaction that often precede it.